Thanks, Brother Josh, and good morning, everyone. The Good Samaritan, or was he the Bad Samaritan? I love these stripy clothed Sunday school pictures. That's kind of what I remember from Sunday school. But and it's probably maybe one of the reasons why we love these stories, but probably not that realistic, probably more something like this. But the Good Samaritan, or really not really, their reputation that they had were actually quite bad. So let's have a look at what we're going to cover this morning. Well, we're going to start in 2 Chronicles. It's a strange place to start on a story of the Good Samaritan, but you'll see why we've started there. We're going to discover a link to the story there of the Good Samaritan. We're then going to explore a little more history on why the Jews and the Samaritans really didn't get along. There was quite a lot of animosity between the Jews and the Samaritans. As far as the Jews were concerned, they were always the bad Samaritans. So we're going to cover a little bit of history on that because it provides, I think, a lot more context to the meaning of the story and the exhortation for us. We'll then have a fresh look at the story in Luke 10. And along the way, we'll, of course, take some exhortations and lessons that we can apply in our own lives in the time ahead. So let's look again at 2 Chronicles, and I want to turn to 2 Chronicles 28. We'll see this as the inspiration for the story of the Good Samaritan. Let's look at the similarities. Second Chronicles 28, I'm going to start from verse 14. So the soldiers gave up the prisoners and plunder in the presence of the officials and all the assembly. The men designated by name took the prisoners, and from the plunder they clothed all who were naked. They provided them with clothes and sandals, food and drink, and healing balm. All those who were weak they put on donkeys. So they took them back to their fellow countrymen at Jericho, the city of palms, and returned to Samaria. Well, we need to look at the backstory to this. To fully appreciate the exhortational value from this story, we need to first set the historical context. Who were the Samaritans? Where did they come from? Where did they live? Who did they worship, if anyone? How did they live? What did they get up to? And I think most importantly, what happened that sparked such a deep animosity, resentment, and distrust between the Samaritans and the Jews? Well, it's difficult to pinpoint who the Samaritans were racially. After the Assyrians conquered the northern kingdom, they imported people into Samaria. Some of the Samaritan Jews then married these importees. Their offspring were called the Samaritans. When the Jews returned after their captivity, the Samaritans wanted a share. They wanted a role in helping to rebuild the temple, but they were rejected because of their pagan practices. And the enmity that occurred there continued through to the time of Jesus. The story starts in 2 Kings 17. So please turn to me with me to 2 Kings 17, verse 24. Today we would call this a large refugee resettlement. 2 Kings 17. The king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, Kuthah Awa, Hamath, and Seraphim, and settled them in the towns of Samaria to replace the Israelites. They took over Samaria and lived in its towns. From the start, we read how these people had a culture of blended worship. We'll take a bit of this, we'll mix it with a bit of that, and get the best of both worlds. Let's read verse 29 to 33. Nevertheless, each national group made its own gods in the several towns where they settled and set up in the shrines the people of Samaria had made at the high places. The men from Babylon made Succoth Benoth, the men from Kuthah made Nergal, the men from Hamath made Ashima. The Arvites made Nibzah and Tartak, and the Seraphites burned their children in the fire as sacrifices to the gods of Sepharvaim. They worshipped the Lord, but they also appointed all sorts of their own people to officiate for them as priests in the shrines at the high places. They worshipped the Lord, but they also served their own gods in accordance with the customs of the nations from which they had been brought. They wanted to be Israelites. They were in so many ways becoming pseudo-Israelites. Verse 40 to 41. They would not listen, however, but persisted in their former practices. Even while these people were worshipping the Lord, they were serving their idols. To this day, their children and grandchildren continue to do as their fathers did. Now, the plot thickens in Ezra. Ezra, we know, records the story of the return of the remnant, exiled but now finally returning to their land. They had a focus that united them. They all wanted to build a temple for their Lord, for their God. Now, Ezra has some juicy details on how the rift developed. So let's turn to that. Ezra, in chapter 4, Ezra has some juicy details on how the rift between the Jews and the Samaritans developed. In chapter 4, we read how the Samaritans wanted in on the action. Verses 1 and 2. They were there, they were willing, and they were able to help. After all, they said, we serve and seek the same God, so we're now just like you. Please let us help. But the offer, you'll see in verse 3, wasn't accepted. It actually was a clear and emphatic thanks for the offer, no thanks. We've seen and we've been observing your style of blended worship, and we frankly don't like it. It doesn't sync with the standard of worship that we promote. That's really what the no thanks said. Now, some would have shrugged it off, gone on their way. Offended, yes. Disappointed, yes. But we'll find another way to make this work. Well, not these Samaritans. This rejection that they got from the Jews set off an aggressive, somewhat feral, and even a vengeful response that escalated further and further, and most definitely helps explain the animosity between these two groups. As we'll see, the Samaritans became devious, conniving, rebellious, even churlish in their response to not being invited to help build the temple. Have a look at verse 4. It tells us the story about how they begin the campaign to undermine the building of the temple. It matures in verse 6 to a formal accusation. In verse 11, they went one step further. We even have a copy of the letter they sent in as their formal complaint. Verse 23, they start to introduce forth, and in verse 24, we see that the work came to a standstill. All from the start, where they both actually wanted to work together. Already the exhortation is clear. Yes, God wants to be worshipped, but he's jealous when we seek to worship him, but still bring all our other gods before him at the same time. This is what the people were doing in 2 Kings 17. Now we read the story and we, I think, say, oh, that's terrible. Why would they do such a thing? Yes, it's easy to point the finger at others, but are we any different? Are we any better in our lives? Do we blend our worship and attention? It is worthy of pause and reflection. Okay, let's get back to the story of the bad Samaritan in Luke 10. Well, we know the story well, but with this background and added colour of the rift between the Jews and the Samaritans, it should help bring even more impact to the lessons we can take from the story. Now, as context, look to how this whole story came up. Brother just read it in verse 25. It was a legalist Jew who asked the question. He was seeking to trap Jesus with his smart questions. And then in verse 29, we see he wanted to justify himself. His motive by then was to save face. The lawyer saw at once that he had convicted himself of asking a question that he already knew the answer to. So in his embarrassment, he asks another question to show that he did have some point in the first place. Who is thy neighbour? Who is our neighbour? And so the wonderful story of the Good Samaritan is told. There are so many links and parallels we can see in the story, and then practical lessons we can take. We're going to just cover a few of them this morning. Verse 30. Do you notice he was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho? You notice the direction he was heading. He was heading down. Not only that, he was heading away from the city of God. When we're in trouble, when we're in distress, in trial, in turmoil in our own lives, what do? Do we head towards God and the company of the ecclesia, or do we turn away and head the other direction? This story, in many ways, is a warning of the consequences if we move our lives away from God when we encounter troubles in our lives. Verse 30. He fell into the hands of robbers. This is symbolic of sin. Sin will find you if you're on the wrong road, on the pathway down to Jericho. It's the road to death. Verse 30, it says again, stripped him of his clothes. The inference here is that his clothes were valuable. They were robbers. They had plans to sell his nice stuff and make some quick cash. It's likely this man, by inference, was wealthy, as he had nice clothes that they wanted to rob him of. Verse 31 and 32, not just the priest, but also then the Levite. These two Jewish men dare not risk ritual impurity by touching a corpse. Yes, they both passed by, but not only that, they crossed on the other side. This wasn't I didn't notice him lying there, I was just too busy checking my phone as I walked down the road kind of moment. This was blatant, deliberate avoidance of the person they saw ahead of them that needed their help. Well, again, it's so easy to judge these thoughtless and uncaring men and their attitude as we read this. But is it possible that we can sometimes be like this with those that need our help? The Levite and the priest, yes, they both failed this man, but did you know that they also blatantly ignored the law that he professed to uphold? Look at Deuteronomy 22, verse 4. Do the same if you find their donkey or cloak or anything else they have lost. Do not ignore it. If you see your fellow traveler's donkey or an ass fallen on the road, do not ignore it. Help the owner get to its feet. Even an animal in need should be cared for. These guys went one step further. Verse 33 starts, but a Samaritan. Now you need to put yourself in the context of what the legalist, remember he was a legalist Jew, heard when he heard but a Samaritan. But a Samaritan was a jarring, not one of us. He was one of those blended, worshipping, refugee, imported, conniving, treacherous, good-for-nothings that I've heard so much about. The Samaritans were despised by the Jews, and his blood would no doubt have been frothing as he heard this story. Makes it go a little bit worse. Verse 33, pity. Compare what is said of the Lord himself in Luke 7, verse 13. And when the Lord saw her, that was the widow of Nain, he had compassion on her. It's the same word. Verse 34, listen for the parallels. His wounds were dressed and he had new clothes to wear. He was strong to save. Put on robes of righteousness. Verse 34, put the man on his donkey. Put? Are you kidding? Everyone knows that you don't move a badly injured man, not without knowing exactly what you needed to do, not without expert medical help. Maybe this Samaritan was a doctor. We knew that he had expensive stuff. That's why he was attacked by the robbers. Maybe he was a doctor. Jesus was a physician for the sick and the needy. It says in verse 34, he put the man and took him. Now, this would have no doubt been a logistical challenge. The man was possibly unconscious or at least incapacitated, and you don't just get onto a donkey and ride off into the sunset. This would have been tortuously slow moving. The picture here gives us some guide or some clues to what it may have looked like. It would have been slow. The Samaritan would have had to support the injured man with his arm beside him. Verse 34, we come to the inn. Here the injured man, battered by sin, is brought into the inn to be cared for and nurtured back to health. The inn here represents the ecclesia. The innkeeper represents the brothers and sisters of the ecclesia. It continues in verse 34, it says, before the injured man is put to bed that night, he would have been cleaned and bathed. And in this, we see a symbolic baptism. Verse 35, the next day. So the Samaritan slept and he rose again. He then asked the ecclesia to care and look after him, to care for the sinners. Verse 35, and he leaves by saying, when I return. Surely this is symbolic of the kingdom when Christ will come again to the ecclesia. Do you think the symbology and significance of this story was lost on the expert in the law that was being told this story? I don't think so. I think it would have hit him hard and it would have hit him right here. You notice in verse 37, as he answers the question that he's asked, he can't even bring himself to say the word Samaritan. He would have gone away with much to digest and much to consider. So as we turn to the emblems this morning, we see a warning to not serve multiple gods and simply blend our worship. We're reminded that we have a responsibility to care for those in need. As an ecclesia, we are the innkeeper, and we are to look after those who turn down the wrong road and are affected by sin. Because let's face it, we all have been. And in our Lord, we see the saving power of his care, because he is the physician. And we see that represented in the emblems of the bread and the wine. We've all been affected by sin. We've all benefited from the healing hands of the physician. So as we see in verse 37, as the story wraps up, Jesus told him, go and do likewise.